Thank you very much for this event happening and me being included into this very interesting and important forum. I will talk to you about something which is necessary when we consider international relations between countries, and I will tell you a few things about currencies, and in particular about commodity currencies. And at the end of the speech, I would like to also make a suggestion, since my findings, I think, are quite important. So I would like to suggest, when East Asia considers to have a common currency, as some people already talked about, I think that best currency for a common currency in East Asia should be a commodity currency, and very probably the Australian dollar. Think about that, but let me tell you how I also arrived in this conclusion. It took me about 9 years to achieve, to arrive at some important conclusions about these commodity currencies. I started the research about 9-10 years ago, and I was thinking that surely the Australian dollar has a different behavior from many other commodity currencies or currencies in general. So finally I succeeded in publishing that article in a quite high impact the Journal of Technological Forecasting and Social Change. And the reason why it was published there is because that journal is related to economic cycles. And economic cycles are very important in forecasting commodity currencies. So cycles and once combined in a particular way, we can do a lot of things about it, surprisingly. And you will see that I forecast the trend of the Australian dollar 7 years ago. And every year up to now, my forecast is very, very good. Now I'm repeating the trend, not the short-term fluctuations. And that is important. Once some people can really forecast that, this is something completely new. So for the first time, this is something completely new and important, because it is well known that it is very difficult to forecast currencies. Okay? So, and since we are in Asia Pacific, the Australian dollar, the Australian dollar, the Canadian dollar, the New Zealand dollar, and the Norwegian crown are part of these commodity currencies, but 3 of them are in the Asian Pacific region. So I think it's very, very important that we analyze them and see their impact. Okay. So here, very briefly, I mean, you can read some of my notes in detail, but I will go through them very quickly and just try to tell you the summary of it. You can see that, first of all, the Australian dollar is related to the commodity currencies, but not completely. Something else is missing here. And some other people have done to examine the commodity currencies. We call them commodity currencies because the countries that have these currencies as their currency are exporting a lot of resources. Like, for example, here you have gold, coking coal, and beef, and veal, and steaming coal, and that sort of thing for Australia, and so on for other countries. So there is something else there we have to take into account. So my research consisted in finding out what other things are going to influence commodity currencies. And Here you have very briefly a few of the commodity currencies. You can see also some other ones there, like the South African currency and so on, the Brazilian real and so on. But let's examine in particular the Australian dollar, and in my article you can find many other details which I'm sure you will find them very interesting and challenging, and it sounds unbelievable that I can really predict such a trend out of the sample. For those who know what I'm talking about, it's not inside the sample. My sample, for example, finished in 2007. I could predict that outside the sample. So this is very unique. So here, just some theoretical things. I mean, I was not really sure coming to this forum how much theoretical, so to speak. Very often they accuse economists of being theoretical. Not really. We try to really see what's happening in the reality. Some of people who, I can recognize some of my colleagues in SNU. I mean, you must know really that we really look at reality. I mean, it's very difficult to copy reality, to find out what's happening there. But let me show you very quickly that the issue of the purchasing power parity hypothesis, the PPP, which has been the basis for explaining and forecasting currencies, has failed, really. People, they thought it had failed. Actually, my research shows that it is finally related once we take into account the long-term cycles. So if it was only short-term cycles, as many people do, then of course the PPP hypothesis will fail. So I'm not going to really bother you with these technical issues in terms of financial economics for currencies, but it's interesting that some other important researchers, they say that this puzzle is like the Russian doll, in that after controlling for two promising real shocks, peeling away layers of the original PPP puzzle, one is still faced with the identical, despite smaller PPP puzzle. So it's interesting that they thought, okay, there's nothing we can do. But I went further. 18 currencies are co-integrated. Co-integrated means they are completely related to each other in a very significant way. So again, the people try to relate these commodity currencies to commodity regular cycles. But overall, the commodity cycles have a cycle of about 8 years. So 8 years was not really enough to analyze and forecast these commodity currencies, which are so important: Canadian dollar, Australian dollar, New Zealand dollar, okay? So something else was happening there, again, once more. Why all these cycles take place? Why even the commodity cycles exist? So, for example, people suggested that it was a 10-year inventory cycle for aluminium industry and the link of this cycle with the metals price. So they started really relating the production and prices of many metals, production and that sort of thing. So surely there was something there, more than we thought. And for example, meteorological cycles, or a very interesting article published in one of the best journals, okay, the Quarterly Journal of Economics. They discovered the Venus 8-year cycle, which affected economics. You know, we should really take all that into account. It's not really a fiction. So, and then many other cycles, like, for example, Here they notice that there is a cycle of 7 to 8 years, 10 years, 7 to 10 years in relation to GDP and that sort of thing, and then a 3 to 5 years period cycle, and then other people have done research on these cycles, you know, like Jukler and Kichin and Kuznets in particular. You know, this goes back. I mean, this is our knowledge. Why should we throw away this knowledge that other people have really spent their whole life trying to find out what's happening? So, and then also another cycle here, like 32-year cycle, etc. Okay, so economic phenomena and cycles are all interrelated, and some other variables which we know according to some other theories, like, for example, the interest rate, etc., etc., etc. I don't have the time really to show everything here in this presentation, but in my article you will find a lot of good relations with what we call the fundamentals in economics about the interest rate and many other issues. So please, if those of you who really are interested in looking into details, you will see that it's not, the economic cycles seem to be like a superstructure, if you like, or infrastructure. It depends from which point of view you take. And the interest rate and other things, they have an impact, but short-term impact. Okay? So my aim was to find the long-term trend. Okay, and for those who want to know really what I did, I based all these things on what we call the spectral analysis, and really made it very simple. So I'm not going to bother you all these technical things. People can still go and find out. I'm sure a lot of you are technically oriented, so you can really follow that, but we don't have the time. And here are the results of my forecasting methodology and what I did about these commodity cycles. So here, for example, you can see that for the Australian dollar, the cycles which I found to be extremely significant, because I did not want to include many cycles. I only tried to include 4 cycles and harmonics. Harmonics means one is the multiple of the other. So, for example, for the Australian dollar, it is 4, 8, 16, and 32. One is the multiple of the other. That's called harmonical analysis. Okay? So these 4 cycles seem to explain the trend of the Australian dollar incredibly well. Now, for the Canadian dollar, the cycles are slightly different, probably because I have more data for the Canadian dollar, and probably then the cycles have really adjusted. You know, I mean, this is all empirically found. And so you have here 4.6, 9.3, 1, etc., etc. So you have multiplication of the cycle by 2 and that sort of thing. Now, for the New Zealander, it is 4.25, then 8.5, then 17, then 34. And the Norwegian krone, but let's not talk about that because it's outside the Asia-Pacific region. And here you have some details about the forecasting, but let's look at the graphs, because very often the graphs really show the reality much better. So here it is. The blue one, okay, are the actual fluctuations of the Canadian dollar here, the New Zealand dollar there. Did I miss the Australian dollar? Yeah. So let's start with the Australian dollar. So here is the Australian dollar. You can see wide fluctuations. This is American cents to the Australian dollar. Okay, that's how I do it. Or Canadian cents to the American dollar. The American cents to the Canadian dollar, or American cents to the Australian dollar, and so on. And you can see the fluctuations are very high, wide, But here, and I mean, this is really the important issue. Up to September 2007, so I stopped I mean, this is one of the samples. I did many other samples in my examination. So suppose we stop here in December 2007. Look at the trend in red line. I forecast that correctly. I'm forecasting that the Australian dollar is going to go down in relation to the American, and it is happening. The same thing for the Canadian, the same thing for the New Zealand. 6, 7 years now, year after year, my forecasts are really perfect. Unfortunately, I don't have money to invest. You know what I mean? So if I had money, I would have become already making a lot of profits there, because the Australian dollar is not really intervened by the government. It's really governed by the forces of demand and supply in the international markets. And that's why it is important. So you can see the errors there, very small and very smooth. The big crisis there, of course, I did not forecast a big crisis, I'm not saying that, but the going after the global financial crisis, you can see that the dollar went back to the trend. Very important. It took about 8 months to go back to the trend. You can see there, after the global financial crisis. So, the same thing for the Canadian dollar. You can see the Canadian dollar not fluctuating so much. The New Zealand one, but again, my forecasts a long time ahead are really incredible. Okay, and let's talk about the Korean won. First of all, this is really an extension which I'm now doing some research on all that, so I cannot really disclose some of the details how I did all that yet, but the Korean won is possible to be forecast. And you can see from here, the Korean won is very much related to the Canadian dollar for different reasons. And I believe I did some research, is that back, those of you who have been working in banks and that sort of thing, probably you will confirm it with me, but a long time ago, the government has related the won to the Canadian dollar when there was a basket of goods to which won was related. So this has been really continued after that in the free markets to some extent. Now here, of course, I did not forecast the Asian financial crisis. No, I mean, the won really was devaluated, but that we can take into account, quantitatively. But look at that, the fluctuations from here like that, then going down, and then like that, all that. This is really following mainly the Canadian dollar. Okay, then I did some similar work to the yen. And as you know, the Plaza agreement in 85 has forced the Japanese yen to revalue. All this was up to there, and then the Plaza agreement in 1985, and it lasted a bit of time, and then finally yen went down, and it was really stabilized around that value of 100 and something. But still the yen is quite a lot, not a lot, but quite a lot to the Australian dollar, mainly. And to some extent New Zealand, but much less to the Canadian dollar. And The Thai baht. The Thai baht, I did something similar. It is much related to the Australian dollar. Although up to here it was fixed exchange regime that prevailed, from there on it was more managed, not completely, but managed by the banks. So you can see some of the fluctuations and so on. I mean, this is just my first approach to this. And then the Chinese RMB. Well, obviously this is the the least free currency. Okay, the government intervenes a lot, so there's nothing to do there. We cannot really predict that. Although, on purpose, I related that to both the Australian dollar and the American dollar. And you can see, in relation to the American dollar, to the Australian dollar, there is a bit of free market forces taking place. Then here I'm trying to say that you can read it, I should really finish it soon, that will the Chinese currency overtake the American dollar? And here, in some ways, I'm saying no. The same thing happened with the yen. Now everybody hopes that the yen will do something. The Chinese RMB will overtake the American as the main currency and all that. But I think, according to my analysis, this is impossible, at least in the immediate future. The overall impact of these currencies, commodity and economic cycles influence commodity currencies, but also commodity currencies have an impact on these cycles. So this is really a very important mutual impact. Commodity currencies have a direct impact on the USA and indirectly on all other currencies. Very important conclusion. So the Korean won is heavily influenced by the Canadian dollar, the Japanese yen by the Australian dollar, and the baht by the Australian dollar and the Canadian dollar. Now, if all currencies were floating, then commodity currencies would dictate the floating of all other currencies to a substantial extent. It seems that these commodity currencies play an incredible role in the global financial world. Much more than we think, and I hope with my research we throw some light into that. And of course you can see, since we are in Asia-Pacific region, which is really the region of the 21st century, everything is happening in this region, probably that's why I'm here too. So I think we ought to take all these things very seriously. That's my humble suggestion. And it is possible to accurately predict all these currencies. So far, this has been done, although, of course, for example, if the euro breaks down or other things take place, obviously we won't have the same thing, okay? I mean, the ceteris paribus, as we say in economics, in other words, some basic assumptions there have to take place. But overall, so far, it has been going like that. So probably that's why now you understand what I'm saying, that East Asia should adopt the Australian dollar as the common currency of the region. Why? Because it is independent. The East Asian countries will not argue with each other. Oh no, it should be yen, no, it should be RMB, or it should be won, or whatever. But here we have a currency that can be easily used for the whole region. And with this suggestion, I finished my talk. Thank you very much.
네, 네, 수고해 주신 사니다스 교수님께 다시 한번